And joining us now from Crimea is Hromadske's own Nataliya Gumenyuk. Nataliya, thanks for joining us.
Good evening.
Nataliya, can you describe what's the situation on the ground like now?
So that's very interesting. 3 years since the occupation, I would remind that wasn't exactly the day when the uniformed gunmen had occupied the parliament of Crimea on the 26th of February 2014. But that's the time when we can already make some we can count on the results. So there are a number of things. These are political, social, some different things connected to the human rights in Crimea. I've been there from time to time for the last 3 years, but now, like, talking to people about how do they feel. So first of all, let's agree then that there is, of course, the huge violation of the human rights in Crimea. Of course, that's not the territory of freedom. It maybe wasn't, but definitely it's not the place where you are, like, expressing your political view is if you disagree with the current situation, because it's even you would have a criminal punishment if you deny the fact what they say is the territorial integrity of Russian Federation. Though it's very interesting to see how easily there were things had been changed, all the name tags, you have all the Russian goods. Politically, the biggest issue is, of course, the persecution of the Crimean Tatar minority. What is most important to understand that they are the people they don't have any other land. They've been deported during the Stalin times, so it's a sacred land for them. So the idea is really just to stay. And maybe out of 300,000, just 20,000 had moved out from Crimea within the 3 years. Though there are more than 20 political prisoners, though it's a very secular group, there are some of them, the practicing Muslims, are accused of, having connection to terrorism. But we've spoken for a lot of their lawyers, and we can prove that there is a very little evidence to the accusation. So we're speaking now about the people being for a year, for 2 years detained. But what's interesting, their families, they are started together. There are volunteers who, collecting funds to help the families. But if you speak about the silent majority, it's probably the most misleading concept you have here, because it's really very, very hard to count the public opinion. So of course there are people who agree on the status quo. You have the all Russian media working here and constantly telling all the stories about how bad is the situation in Ukraine. Though we should agree that the Russian salaries and the Russian pensions are way higher, though the prices are also higher, because most of the goods had to be shipped to the Crimea from the Russian mainland through ferries. So there is no lack of goods. We also should also agree that there shouldn't be myth about some kind of deficits of the goods. You have a lot of things. You have maybe, if not the big Western chains, the other shops there. So basically you have everything, and people traveling to Rostov, while you also have more than 100,000 of the civil servants coming from Russia. First of all, there are people from the law enforcement, the courts, police, prosecutor office. So they have the highest salaries. They bring the families here. So there is the story about tourists not coming, because you do have a lot of Russian tourists coming. But they are it's a different kind of tourism. So that's something. You also can't forget that there are people who maybe disagree with the status quo. There could be minority, but I said, it's very, very unclear how you quantify these numbers, because you can't really make the poll, because of course of the political situation, the opinions are not expressed. But of course there are people, these are the Crimean Tatars, but not just them. who understand that the house is there. They shouldn't be just leave because they disagree. Because for them it's very important to preserve this situation. But for a lot of people, the success of Ukraine would be probably the biggest sign of things, of hope for something. But they hardly can see that, especially because of course you have very poor connection with mainland. The Ukrainian policy towards the Crimean Peninsula is not very clear. But probably what is most interesting for me, it was to hear that in particular Crimean Tatars were telling that they are first of all offended when the people outside of the peninsula are creating all kind of ideals of another deal. They say that we are not slaves to be really that somebody else decides what country we should belong. There is a international law, so it really matters for them. So of course I should admit, of course, it's not the military zone, it's not a conflict zone, though you have a lot of Russian military people, personnel coming, yet it's still a resort. It's definitely coming closer to this kind of Soviet-style resort. But the capitalism is coming anyway. It's you have the Russian change, Russian shops and restaurants that is there. But definitely the best way to stay here, it's really to be a civil servant. That probably would, if you get this job, and if you pretend that you are outside of politics, you of course can pursue, you of course can leave. But that is, I would say, anyways, 3 years. I was here 3 years ago, and I've been there later. But you really can already assess that it had happened. Yet for a lot of people, the story is not over.
And you mentioned political prisoners. Are those strictly Crimean Tatars, or are there other political prisoners that you wanted to mention at all?
So there are different types. There are Crimean Tatars, but there are a few different articles. So the practicing Muslim are usually detained with the charge of of the terrorism, or belonging to the Islamic Party, Hizb ut-Tahrir. You basically don't need to prove anything to say that the person belongs to this group. And also we have the civil gathering of this is a Mejlis. This is the self-governing organ of the Crimean Tatars. So if you used to belong to that organization, which is a political, secular organization, you could be. It had been named an extremist organization, but these are the famous Soviet dissidents who were the members of the Mejlis. So currently the deputy head of one of the deputy head of Mejlis, Ahtem Chigos, for 2 years is in prison. And what is interesting, he's in particular accused of creating a riot at this date on the 26th of February 2014 in front of the Crimean parliament. So all the video record proves that he was exactly the person who tried to maintain law and order and peace, protest at that moment. So these kind of people are, but besides you have a Ukrainian journalist. Most of the Ukrainian journalists have left the territory. I mean, I won't say most of the journalists, I won't say the Ukrainian by ethnicity, the journalists who more or less doesn't accept the annexation, because of course you have a lot of people moved to the pro-government, pro-regime TV channels, which are pretty rich. So interesting, for instance, Mykola Semena case is interesting. He's also charged. And this person, an incredible man, he has written his first article 50 years ago. For 50 years, he's been writing during the Soviet times. It's 2017 since he is not allowed to write any longer. So you have a lesser of, another political prisoners, but for that you're either but of course the Crimean Tatar is somehow considered to be as a targeted group, because they are the most active. They are openly opposed. They do not resist, because the idea of the Crimean Tatar group is really this non-violent resistance, not acceptance of occupation, though most of them had to take a Russian passport, it's almost automatic. Without that, you can't really do anything. You know, like if you really decided to get the residency, a permanent residency, and to be considered as a foreigner, you really can't have a proper life. It's really, really hard. You really need to be a very, strong personality to do that.